Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm pleased to host the library, two of my colleagues from the library, Christina Winter, who's the Copyright and Scholarly Communications Librarian, and Brad Doerksen, who's the Student Success Librarian. And they're going to speak to us about Creative Commons licenses. And as you've heard, the meeting's being recorded so that we can post it for those that couldn't attend. So with that said, I'll let Brad and Christina take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Isaac. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today. As Isaac mentioned, we're going to be looking at Creative Commons licenses. And yeah, I'll just bring up our agenda. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at kind of three main things. So first, we're going to look at understanding a bit about Creative Commons licenses when sharing and creating our own resources. Then we're going to shift to finding and using existing Creative Commons licenses that have already been published with an open license. And then we're also going to look at some of the implications and considerations when you're looking at applying a CC license to your own work or using a CC license in a work. So just a bit of background about where Creative Commons started and why it's around. So Creative Commons originates out of the United States. And in 1998, there was a bill that introduced a copyright term extension. So this is known as the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. And under the Berne Convention, the typical term of copyright protection is the life of the author plus 50 years. But this Term Extension Act actually increased the term of copyright protection by an additional 20 years. So the term of copyright protection for most works, there are a few different changes, but is typically now the life of the author plus 70 years. So this concerned quite a few people because the term of copyright protection has continually been expanding. It seems to keep getting longer and longer and longer. So this causes some concerns about when material actually enters what's known as the public domain. So work can be used without copyright permission or payment to the copyright owner. So there was a case, it was actually brought a little bit earlier, but it was known basically as Eldred versus Ashcroft. And what this case did is it challenged the constitutionality of this copyright term extension and said, this continual term extension seems to be in conflict with maybe this idea of, where it falls under the Constitution. So unfortunately, they lost at the US Supreme Court. But around the same time, they started to look at, okay, if we can't make some changes, the law keeps changing. We're maybe not super successful in that area. What can we do to allow creators a bit more control over their use of their own works? So you're still working within the copyright system, but what if you want to be able to change things a little bit more? Let's just say you're like, I want to keep some of my copyrights, but I want to release them in a bit of a different way. So that's kind of where Creative Commons came in to work with the system of copyright, but make a bit more flexibility and have some licenses. So Creative Commons was founded in 2002 by Lawrence Lessig and other members, which I can provide some information after if you're interested in the history. And the idea behind Creative Commons was that it was going to be a set of public copyright licenses. So these licenses they're legal tools that can be applied to copyrighted works to give varying levels of permission. Also, Creative Commons was very much inspired by the larger open movement. So if anyone's familiar with the open software movement, where creators release their code under open licenses, so instead of being protected under, a very proprietary model, they'll let people kind of join in, make some changes to that. So it's very much inspired by that, as well as other type of open movements. So basically, again, why Creative Commons? Why would you even need this set of licenses? So if we're looking at copyright law, the default in copyright law is if you create an original expressive work, you're granted a set of exclusive rights. And the default position is all rights reserved. I keep everything. There's some limitations and exceptions in the Copyright Act, but that's the default. So that model is fine for some people, but maybe not all creators. Some creators may want to do different things. So Creative Commons allows creators a varying set of kind of scale of how open and how kind of free they wish their work to be reused. And it allows them to make it clear to people using their work how their work can be reused in different ways. So it's creating this framework that works within the existing copyright law. And again, I think the best way to put it is Creative Commons licenses allow the creators to determine which rights they want to use. So they use the term some rights reserved in comparison to the all rights reserved model. So Creative Commons licenses are legal tools that let the end user know how a work can be used in advance, instead of the all rights reserved model where you either are looking either to copyright exceptions, or maybe you have to go to the copyright owner to request permission to do something with the work. The great thing about Creative Commons licenses is they're very upfront about how a work can be used without further needing to seek permission from the copyright owner. If you want to do something in the license that's not permitted by the license, you always have the option of contacting the copyright owner to ask for it. But the licenses are quite clear, which is nice, that it'll let you know upfront what you can and cannot do with the work. You don't need further payment as well, as long as you're within the terms of the license. So a Creative Commons has really basic 4 license elements, and there is some text by it, but if you see them, there's usually little symbols. So the first one is at the top, and that's the attribution or BY symbol. This is a requirement of really all Creative Commons licenses. And this means that you need to provide credit to the creator of the work. The next one underneath, so kind of the upside down C, is share alike, or the SA symbol. So if you're looking at a Creative Commons work with the share alike icon, if you're making an adaptation of that work, then you need to release your adaptation of that work under the same license. And this is very much inspired by really the open software movement, where you're saying, we're going to give you permission to use this, but we also want you to donate your work back to the commons, kind of work within that movement. And if you're familiar with Wikipedia, the content under Wikipedia is licensed under a Creative Commons attribution share alike license. The next one is the non-commercial symbol, so NC. So this means that only non-commercial uses of a work are permitted. So basically saying you can use work under different things as long as you're not using it for commercial purposes. If you do want to use it for commercial purposes, then you would need to contact the copyright holder to see if you could do this. And that could require further permission or payment. And it's important to note that it's looking at the non-commercial uses of the work, not necessarily the commercial use, like if a commercial entity can use the work. So just is your use non-commercial or not? So that's an important kind of distinction. And then the last symbol is the no derivatives or ND symbol. And what that basically means is that you cannot make adaptations of that work and re-release it back into there. So that's basically you're using it is the creator does not want you to make changes to this particular document. So there's 6 different types of Creative Commons licenses. And as you can see here, these are just the exact definitions from the Creative Commons website about exactly what the licenses allow. So we have the Creative Commons by, so that allows people to use the work for any purpose, even commercially or modified form, as long as they give credit to the creator. Then we have the Creative Commons attribution share alike. Again, I'd already mentioned that. The attribution no derivatives license. So you can use the work provided you give credit, but you can't make any changes to the work. Then you have the attribution non-commercial work. Again, you can use the work as long as you give attribution. but you can't use it for commercial purposes. The attribution non-commercial share alike allows people to use the work for non-commercial purposes only, as long as you give attribution to the creator and make any adaptations you share available under the same license. And the last one is the attribution non-commercial no derivatives license. And this is the most restricted of the license because it's basically saying you can use the unadapted work for non-commercial purposes only, and as long as you give attribution to the creator. So there's kind of, a scale of from the most open of the license, from the CC BY to the most restricted of the 6 licenses, which is the non-commercial no derivatives license. So when you're thinking about applying a Creative Commons license to your own work, there's quite a few things you'll need to consider. And one of the first ones I'd like to just mention is if you're thinking about applying a Creative Commons license to your own work that you've created, so it's important to keep that in mind, is that they are irrevocable. Once you apply the license, you can't go back and change your mind and say, I'm not sure about this license. That's it. It's irrevocable. So that's something you need to really think carefully about. Is once the work is put out there, you could take the work down from the internet, but if I still own a copy, I can still use that work. It's irrevocable. You can make it maybe inaccessible, but the license still applies to that particular work. Other things to think about is where CC licenses are appropriate or inappropriate to apply. So for example, a Creative Commons license isn't the best license to apply to software, for example. There's specific software open copyright licenses that are better suited for software. Other things which maybe a Creative Commons license isn't great to apply to is trademarks, for example. Like that's, you wouldn't necessarily want that to be applied. So think about the type of work you're creating and where the license would be useful. Again, we also have the nature of the work. So Creative Commons is quite explicit about the types of works where the licenses shouldn't be applied. So for example, if a work is already in the public domain, you probably shouldn't be applying a Creative Commons license to that work. You don't have the rights to do that. So that's important to note. And then the type of license. Again, which type of license do you want to apply? So I used the example of Wikipedia earlier. So if you're contributing to Wikipedia, then you need to actually use the license that's used in Wikipedia, which is the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. This is a really handy tool that Creative Commons has used, and we actually used it for this presentation. It's the Creative Commons License Chooser, and it's a bit of a step-by-step process where it shows you put in, maybe kind of takes you through a decision-making tool. Do I know which license I want to use? Do I want it to be used for commercial purposes? Yes or no? And kind of takes you through a series of step-by-step questions, which helps you determine which license would be most appropriate for your use. We also used it as well, where it creates some text for you and just puts it in your presentation. It's giving you some nice HTML code, other things where you can apply it to your website, things like that. So I think it's a really great tool. The specific tool we use is currently in beta mode, but I found it works really well. And one thing I did want to say as well, if you've noticed, I've tried to, through this presentation, Brad and I have marked, how exactly, Creative Commons licenses can be shown and applied to a work as well. So how do you attribute a Creative Commons license work? And this is really important because sometimes people will see a Creative Commons license and they're not necessarily attributing the work appropriately and including all the elements. So the kind of best way to think about it is the title, author, source, and license. So when this is really an ideal attribution. So if we're looking at this particular image, we have the title of work, which is large copyright sign made of jigsaw puzzle pieces. So we've hyperlinked that back to the original image. Then we have the creator of it, and then we have the license, and we're always including the link back to the license. And that's really important to notice because some of the versions of the licenses actually have that as a requirement, and the license can be null and void if you're not including all those elements. Good idea as well as if you're having the source included as well. So you're trying to always include those elements when you're thinking about, how am I going to actually attribute this work? We've included these images, we've included the citations right beside the images. But for example, if you were doing this in a PowerPoint or a book or things, it wouldn't necessarily need to be, underneath the image. For example, you could have it on a credits page, things like that. But it's always important to include, yes, all these types of elements when you're attributing a Creative Commons licensed work. Whoops. And now I'm going to turn over to Brad.
All right, thanks, Christina. So I wanted to shift now to looking at how do I find Creative Commons licensed work? And certainly as the sort of both the open education movement generally, as well as sort of open pedagogy and all the other kinds of open initiatives continue to gain momentum, we find that there are increasingly larger numbers of Creative Commons licensed content available to be found, which then raises the challenge of, well, how do I search for and find all these wonderful things that have been created and released under these some rights reserved, but the flip side, of course, of some rights reserved is some rights waived, right? So there's essentially, I've got permission in advance by the creator to use their works in various ways, right? And so education tends to be able to take really good advantage of CC licensed content because we're non-commercial. And so that if you're ever uncertain, it's always best to consult with someone to say, is this particular use commercial or not? But education is generally considered non-commercial, even though we charge tuition. I don't know if Christina wants to speak further to that at the end, but we're not making a profit, as it were, right, on our tuition. So that's all an aside to saying, where do I find all these wonderful learning objects and other creations that I can work into, whether it's a open textbook I'm creating, just simply wanting to share resources as they exist with my students in UR courses, for example. One place to start is Creative Commons. The organization themselves now have a search engine, and we've got the hyperlink there to search.creativecommons, and it's essentially a search engine that's built to find Creative Commons licensed resources from a variety of internet sources. And so they've got sort of a whole databases of repositories of various websites that have these CC licensed content on them, and gives you sort of a single search engine that's specifically built to find that kind of content for you. One sort of common repository as well is the Wikimedia Commons, right? And so this was a resource that was built by the same organization that runs Wikipedia, and they very quickly found, right, that they needed visuals, graphics, visualizations, video, all those sort of supporting materials to support the sort of text content on Wikipedia. And that's really where Wikimedia Commons comes from, is same idea as Wikipedia, right? It's these community created resources that are then put into the commons that are linked to from the Wikipedia articles, but the database really has all sorts of items in it that may not even appear in a Wikipedia entry somewhere. They're simply this big database of, a lot of it is images, visualizations, there's some video in there, but it's these kind of supporting materials for Wikipedia, but there's a ton of images in there. So it's a great place to look for sort of graphics and graphic content in that sense. And then we've got some links here as well to the smart copying website, and it sort of is it's a handy guide. There's just a list of how-to, some search ideas, some tips on finding CC content, including tips for using Google search, right? So Wikimedia Commons, the Creative Commons search engine, are targeting particular databases of CC licensed content. But if you're just wanting to do that sort of that worldwide global Google search kind of approach, because there is a lot of CC content out there. Those links, and so I won't go down that rabbit hole, but we did want to point you to that resource. And then the other thing I just mentioned is a lot of services have a CC search function in them. So if you're in YouTube or Vimeo or Flickr or other platforms like this, they will have filters or limiters that you can use to say, oh, I only want to search for CC licensed content, which does depend on the uploader to have marked their upload with the appropriate CC license, which they will usually do if they're wanting to attach a license. They'll indicate that when they've uploaded. But it sort of saves you the trouble of doing a search and then just scanning your results for CC licenses. They will just allow you to limit your search that way. So again, it can be helpful. So maybe you're saying, I need a photo at this point in my project, or an illustration to illustrate my point, and I want to find one on Flickr, for example. I can just do a CC search, and some of them even will allow you to say, what kind of CC license am I looking for? So some of those more restrictive ones you can filter out. So how that functions depends a little bit on the platform, but a lot of platforms have that available. So those are just some examples of where to find CC licensed content generally. Thinking, especially these are helpful when you're wanting to find, charts, graphs, images, those kinds of things. But then there are sort of larger kinds of CC licensed content where it's an entire project. This could be an open textbook. It could be maybe even an entire course. A lot of MOOCs get licensed under a CC license so that they're sort of put out into the commons with a CC license attached to them. And that's where specific repositories, you can advance the slide. Thank you, Christina. And again, these are just a few examples. So one would be sort of what I call large multi-format collections. So this is a big repository that's collecting all manner of items. So these aren't just sort of an individual image or graphic, but this will be a course, a training manual, a white paper, a textbook, other kinds of documents, and at various levels. So these collections include everything from resources developed specifically to support K-12 education to post-secondary education, things that are maybe just of general interest to the public at large. And they've sort of collected all of these resources into a large searchable database. Two that I most frequently go to, one is called Merlot, and the other one is OER Commons. And so those would be two examples of these kind of really big repositories. So often if, for example, you're saying, I'm teaching this course, are there alternatives to the $300 commercial textbook for my students where I can save them a bundle of money and increase the chances the students will actually have access and read the textbook? Maybe there's an open textbook out there, or a collection of textbooks that I can assemble various chapters from, and if they're CC licensed, I can probably do that and assemble my own sort of custom reading list fairly quickly. These would be two examples of repositories that I tend to go to first to do some of those kinds of searching if I'm just sort of looking for resources that I might want to make available to students to support educationally. Then we also have some more focused local collections. The library has an open educational resources research guide that you can find through the library's homepage. And there is we're in development, it's well along, coming soon. I think in about a month or so, we're hoping to launch a sort of a University of Regina curated guide sorted by subject area of sort of recommended openly licensed educational resources. And we're going to host that on the Pressbooks platform that we are now using at the university as our sort of primary platform for developing open textbooks and other kind of open resources. And then there are some collections that are specifically just sort of post-secondary openly licensed textbooks. And this tends to be more targeted that way. But BC Campus is sort of the leader in Canada, although some other provinces, Ontario in particular, are catching up in terms of having a sort of a provincial database of all of their openly licensed textbooks. And BC they had provincial funding before a lot of other provinces did. So they kind of got out of the gate a little bit earlier that way. And they're sort of have been the leader since then as a result. OpenStax would be one example of an American project where they're collecting, again, sort of textbooks that support typical undergraduate, commonly taught courses, across post-secondary, at that sort of entry level. And OpenStax recently announced they've gotten another huge chunk, multi-million-dollar allotment of funding to develop more open textbooks. So that's an example of a great American repository. And again, you're always thinking through these things like, is American content okay? Do I specifically need Canadian content? Depends on, of course, your subject, your course, the approach you're taking. So these are some examples, but my closing thought on these repositories is there are many, many others out there. And so, this is a great place to start if you want to do your own searching, but my advice always is, and it's not like I'm unhappy to help. I'm always happy to help, as is Christina with these kinds of things. But I like to refer faculty members in particular to your subject librarian to sort of as a great starting place to say, hey, I'm thinking of an open textbook. Can we talk a little bit more about what this might mean for this given course? Here's my needs, the needs of my students. And your subject librarians, really, they know you, your subject area, and what's available within those particular disciplines. And then they call in myself or Christina or other support as needed when there's particular questions that may arise. But it's a great conversation to have with your subject librarian, whether it's, I want to save my students money, I want to lower the costs, I just want to make my course in UR courses more robust. Are there ancillary materials, other supporting content that I could embed into the or alongside the materials that I've developed in UR courses to teach my course? Students get tired of me as a talking head on my videos for my course. Is there someone else's voice that they could hear for a change? All of those kinds of things, right? That's where a lot of this openly licensed content can come in really handy, even if it isn't a full sort of textbook adoption. So consult widely. And then the final stage is maybe you're working on a project, right? Whether it's developing an open textbook of your own that you want your students and other students around the country or the world to use, or other kinds of projects that you're working on and wanting to release under a Creative Commons license. What do I do with the things that I find and then embed into my own project? And so you're gathering all of these various resources that may have these different licenses, right? So Christina kind of went through those 6 licenses, and I'm feeding in, some of them I find are CC BY, and some maybe are CC BY ND, and some are CC BY NC, and I'm funneling this all into my project, hoping that my students and students generally will benefit. But how does that work? And this is kind of where it can get confusing, because if I use a share-alike licensed image, so I find this great chart and it's licensed non-commercial, or share-alike license, what does that, do I now have to share my entire project under the same license that chart was licensed under because I'm using that one chart? And these are all the kinds of questions that can arise when you're embedding CC licensed objects that you found into your own larger project. Or what if I adapt a chart? It wasn't, there wasn't a no derivative, so I can adapt it. Now I've adapted this chart, I'm putting it into my project. What are the implications of all of this? And so then on the next slide, we sort of have this visualization of which are the compatible licenses and which are not. And so it's sort of a handy way of saying, if I'm creating something that I'm going to want to license at the end of the day under this kind of license, what are the licenses under which my various source content that I'm finding, so that those are the pieces that I'm not creating, that I'm grabbing something with a CC license and wanting to put into my projects, can I or can I not use that in my project? And so that's really what this chart does. So you can just sort of cross tabulate, right? So I'm not going to bore you with running through all of these scenarios, but if you are interested in having this chart, we're happy to, you can come back to this presentation, or we're happy to share. And of course, this is why attribution and linking back to the sources is so important. So you can see our citation there. So if you're quick, you can jot that down and find it at the original source on the CC website. So but again, anytime you're up against this, you're looking at the chart and if it doesn't make sense or something's unclear, again, just just fire a question off. This is probably more Christina's expertise even than mine. She's done the CC training course, so she knows this inside and out more than I do. But fire an email to either one of us, and we're always happy to walk people through some of the implications of a particular question. And there are questions, right? So the idea behind CC licenses is they're simple and easy to understand, but then there's a whole legal code that actually stands behind those symbols. And that's where the interpretation can sometimes be a little bit tricky, and you might want to consult a copyright librarian to sort of say, am I actually understanding this correctly? So sort of in closing, other resources to follow up on. We have many resources that are available to you. Isaac is available. He's our OER program manager at the U of R, and certainly he's familiar with CC licensing and the kinds of open projects that are going on at the university. And so he's a great resource. The library, I've already sort of talked about our subject librarians. Of course, we have expertise in copyright, understanding these licenses, finding objects or learning resources, subject specific support, as well as sort of the publishing side, making your content available, whether that's on the Pressbooks platform, through our institutional repository that the library hosts, open journal publishing. There's a whole range of supports and services that the library offers for you. And then we have some links here as well to online resources that sort of guide you through educational uses of openly licensed materials. So those are some additional resources that you might want to follow up on. Whether you're creating something, whether you're simply looking for content that's already been created by someone else that you want to simply use in a teaching or learning environment. So that is, I think, the end of our presentation, and I believe we have lots of time, excellent, left for questions that you might have.
Thank you, Christina and Brad, for the great presentation, giving us lots of information to consider. And if any of you have any questions, just feel free. Elena, you can just put your questions in the chat if your video is still not working.
Okay, maybe I'll just try. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I've had people complain about this headset, so okay, so I have two questions actually. So the one question was when you're talking about how the CC licenses are irrevocable after you've said, I want this to be my CC license. Is it the same even if you want to change it to have fewer restrictions? So let's say I publish something under a more restrictive CC license, and then I decide down the road, I'm like, actually, I'd prefer more people to have access to this, so I'd like to make it broader. Can I change it at that point?
Yeah, so one of the things you could do with that, if you decided to change, so let's just say I want to make this PowerPoint presentation. We initially put it as Creative Commons attribution non-commercial. Then, that's on this PowerPoint, but then Brad and I decide, actually, we want to make it just attribution. One of the things you could do is you could re-release another version. That's probably the easiest thing to do, but the original one would still apply. But if you wanted to re-release it under something else, where I think it becomes quite tricky is, like if someone wanted to kind of change it particularly to something more restrictive, I think that's the thing people sometimes like, well, I am not very happy with this and I want to change it. Well, you can re-release it under something else, but that particular, that underlying work, the license doesn't change. And one of the reasons for that is because when they were creating Creative Commons licenses, there's the actual, when you look at the license, there's a whole legal code with it. And it's trying to say, if people don't feel how would you ever feel comfy being able to use a license if people could change it all the time? So that's really the rationale for saying, I need to feel confident that when I'm using this work, that someone's not going to change their mind, a year later, decide I don't like the license. So really that's one of the things people really need to think about, because that has become, I know I've even been to presentations where people have possibly maybe been a bit dissatisfied with say if they've published in a journal and it's required this particular license, and then something maybe down the line maybe hasn't gone exactly the way they expected, but that's what the license is. And maybe they just didn't fully understand that. But then again, you can't go back and change that underlying work. So there's, I mean, I guess there's some positives for one side in that the end user should feel confident, but again, to always be aware that, yeah, what you put on that particular piece of work, like that stays. But I certainly know people have done like versioning of things where they've maybe made it more, but the underlying work, that particular work you've released it in, it can't change.
Okay, that makes sense. I have another question, but I'll let Keegan go first because I can see another hand up.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just have a question. So you said, I think Christina, you said earlier about Creative Commons licensing. Only a copyright owner can apply a CC license to a work. So, okay, I know you know, and some people know that there's a project that I'm working on with a team. And so if the journal, for instance, so how would it work? I don't want to get too technical. So we would send out a sheet like when we have on our website, like to submit to our journal, and then we get the applicant, if it's going to go through the peer review process, to sign not an affidavit, but it would sign some kind of form saying that it's going to be, your work is going to be in some kind of creative, like I don't know yet, but in a Creative Commons licensing, then they would have no choice. Either they want their paper to be accepted into the journal or they don't. But I'm just curious, how would that, I guess I probably will make a meeting with you later, but I just was interesting to know if that would be what you would have to do.
Yeah, so what you're basically doing at that point, and I can give you an example of it, is you would have an author agreement. So what the journal basically needs to know. So if I write, for example, an article, I decide to publish in an open access journal, I sign an agreement with the journal. There's usually quite a few different things in there. So for example, a lot of journals would say, like, we want to be the first place to publish this. We won't accept it if it's been published somewhere else. And one of the conditions of being accepted in this journal is that you agree to have, a Creative Commons license applied to your work. So I'm still the copyright owner, for example. The journal just kind of needs to know, hey, do we have the right to do this? So you are getting someone to agree that, yes, that can be applied to your work. So it's not that you're applying the license without the author's permission. You're getting their permission to do it, but you're also saying this is one of the conditions to be published in this particular journal, that's what you would have to do. So for example, I would think that would be the same way with any of the open textbooks that are published. You would say, like, this is one of the requirements to being in this, is that, like, we have to be able to apply this license, but you are getting their advance permission. So really the copyright owner is still the person, agreeing to have this license applied. The journal in this particular case, they're not the copyright owner, but they do need to be able to say, like, hey, can we actually publish this? And if we're doing it, we would have the license. What I think the main thing about the Creative Commons not applying it to different works, and it was funny because I was just kind of reading through this. So let's just say, sometimes I see people, like, I would say I've seen things misapplied. So let's just say I find a photo online. I'm like, yeah, I kind of like this. I can't then go and apply a Creative Commons license to it. It's not mine. I'm not making the decision. So with the author agreement, like, you are getting their permission to be able to apply it. And again, they're the ones making the decision. So yeah, because sometimes I see people like applying like they're just like putting a Creative Commons license on something. I'm like, you don't have the right to do that. Like, you're not the copyright owner. You can't do that. So that's, yeah, something where does that help explain that a little bit? Like, it is in an author agreement. And I can send you something. I know we're in conversations about stuff, but yes, we do have a sample author agreement where, you ask quite a few different things. And that's one of the things you would ask, is if they would feel comfy with that license. I guess the last thing I have as well is I've seen with some journals as well, sometimes they give people the option under which license they want to apply, but a lot of the times they're just saying the journal's licensed under this. And that's just one of the conditions of, publishing in that journal.
Elena, you had another question?
Yeah. So I guess this is probably kind of related to what Keegan was asking. So if, let's say, it would be kind of the same thing as a YouTube video. So like I'm thinking about Sask Library Association stuff. Like if in future we decided to do some kind of videos like we have in the past, and we want other libraries to be able to use them, it's like, I assume anybody appearing in those videos, you would just have them sign some kind of release form that would say, like, I understand and I'm cool with the CC license that we've decided on. And then that would be like just how you get about that. And I assume that's not something that could go back like retroactively, or could it?
Yeah, you can ask after the fact as well. I mean, I think with most things, get it in writing, so it doesn't like, as with many things, you have proof about doing this, because sometimes I think, like, I'm just trying to think, like, we're giving this presentation right now. We're licensing this particular work. Our PowerPoint is available under a Creative Commons license. Like, you know, Brad and I talked about it. Isaac asked, could this be recorded? That's fine. We could apply the CC license to this. So if someone wanted to use this presentation at a time, but I think I would be okay in this context if, you know, afterwards Isaac said, hey, would you mind if we, you know, license this presentation under an open license? I think I would be fine with that. I mean, that wouldn't be a problem to come back. I think it's always helpful though, to, if you can, in this particular case, ask up front, so you're not having to go back, but the permission still needs to be done, you know, at some point, to say, can we release this? So I wouldn't say, yeah, try and do that up front. I think is good. I think it's very helpful. I mean, I can only speak from my own particular perspective. I work in copyright, so a lot of the materials I create or my colleagues create, like, we share and adapt all the time, and it's very helpful to have that, you know, know that something's available to be done. It just really takes a whole step out. A lot of the times we're all doing very similar material. So if you can build and, you know, share that material, it's very helpful, I think. And yeah, to have it, and just once you start getting in the practice of it, I think, yeah, because we're just building on things and improving it. So yes, if you can certainly do, yeah, get it in writing, have an agreement. Again, I can provide you with something after if you're interested as well.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Are there any other questions anybody has? Go ahead, Keegan.
All right, sorry if I'm taking your time. I just have one last question. So maybe I missed this. Like, I always thought when you do copyright, you have to go through a formal process, go to like a patent office and get like a, say, I can just arbitrarily put something copyright, like hypothetically, and it's copyrighted. Or I just don't know how that process works. Do you have to contact an agency to get that done, or I don't know.
No, that's okay. Yeah, copyright in Canada, we'll focus on this. The threshold for copyright protection is actually fairly low. There are a few things you need to meet. So one, the work has to be original. And really what copyright protects is the original creative expression of a fixed work. And once you've met those requirements, your work is eligible for copyright protection. You don't need to register, mark it with the copyright symbol, all rights reserved. There is the Canadian Intellectual Property Office where you can register a work, but that's not a condition of copyright protection. So, for example, in this particular presentation, the fact that it's recorded is a fixation. We're expressing some things. This work automatically is protected by copyright. Because it's meeting the conditions to make the work eligible for copyright protection. And the fact that I'll just say Brad and I are probably the copyright owners of the video recording, then we get to decide what happens to that particular work. Yeah, so like, yeah, you don't, it's quite low actually. Patents, trademarks, those are different. They're different branches of intellectual property, but copyright, yeah, you don't need to register for it. So I think people are always a little bit surprised how much stuff is protected by copyright. Again, films, videos, images, drawings, many things, are protected by copyright.
Yeah.
Does that help?
It's basically automatic, right? If I scratch,
it is automatic, yeah.
If I scratch a haiku on my napkin at Smitty's, that's got copyright protection as soon as I've written it down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I guess if I could just have one last comment. The one thing I do recommend, I find it very helpful. I took the course, as Brad mentioned, but at the bottom, we put the Creative Commons certificate for educators, academic librarians, and galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. It's a really good course, and I enjoyed taking it, but all the course content is available. It's openly licensed, so it's available for anyone to consult. There's so many things that are useful in this course. So even if you don't enroll in the course, like the content is, I just found very, very helpful. And even though I'd been working with copyright for many years, there were still new things I learned in the course. So I really recommend, if you have a chance or have some time, it's a really wonderful resource to consult.
Okay, so if nobody else has any questions, we'd like to thank Christina and Brad for their excellent presentation and for their answers. And and is that a wave, Elena?
No, sorry, that was a clap.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, and we definitely will look for, I guess, a copy of your presentation so we can post it with the video, so that if anybody wants to sort of refer to what you've said, then we can have both the video and the presentation available for them. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye. Oops. I'll stop.